Welcome and thank you for joining today. My name is Sarah Mason and I'm a Senior Policy Associate at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University. And I'm just going to open up today with a few quick notes before I pass things over to our speakers. First, I do want to say that we will be recording today's session and I'll be sending around a link of the recording to everyone who registered. So if you want to revisit any of this information, or if you missed any of today's webinar, you will be able to see that recording. I also do want to let you know that after the presentations are finished, we will have a Q&A. So if you do have questions for our presenters, please type them into the Q&A box and we can try to get to as many of those questions as possible before the end. We have two hosts of today's webinar. The first is the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, which is an information and knowledge exchange hub for policy work and research on ecosystem services and nature-based solutions. And the other host is the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, which has a mission to build policies that deliver spectacular improvement in the speed of environmental progress. If you want to find out about future webinars like this and get a quarterly newsletter with ecosystem services and nature-based solutions updates, you can sign up for the NESP mailing list at the link that I'll drop in the chat in just a moment. But first, I want to pass things off to our first speaker, Tim Mayle, who is Executive Director of EPIC, who's going to provide an overview of biodiversity credits to get us started today.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Really pleased to be here, and thank you everybody for joining this webinar. Give me 1 second while I just get my slides up. And there we go. Perfect. So again, Tim Mayle, Executive Director of the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. As Sarah said, our mission is to focus on going faster. And I can explain to you a bit through my remarks and then in any Q&A why we think the Biodiversity Net Gain policy, or BNG, as it's called in England, is just such an exceptionally important milestone in global policy around nature and biodiversity. I thought this is a helpful slide to start off with. It shows from the Pollination Group a recent world tour of types of voluntary biodiversity credit schemes that exist globally. I could add to this a map of places where there are, regulatory schemes that exist, regulatory systems where, in exchange for, a permit to pursue some sort of development or land or water impacting activity, there is a structure through which either money changes hands to support some counter effort to uplift nature with government, or where it goes into some sort of private structure like a bank structure. But these voluntary systems are spreading rapidly around the world, with the Conference of Parties for the Biodiversity Convention happening in Colombia in October, and a set of other things going on. I expect to see kind of rapid spread of both pilot projects and programs, all around the world. I think the most recent one of new policy I'm aware of in the voluntary front is in Australia, where they have a new nature repair market and law that is attempting to bring private money into the restoration of nature using a kind of a biodiversity credit structure to do so. There's a group called the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which EPIC is a part of. And they're producing a whole host of reports, including on Indigenous people and local community views on biodiversity credits. And the one I thought I'd highlight here is the one that was published in December of last year on potential demand sources for biodiversity credits. The list is below there, but the two that I wanted to focus on is, first, businesses that are trying to comply with some sort of global or regional regulatory requirement or a national regulatory requirement, or government agencies, development banks that are putting in place policies and regulations. And those places, those markets, are likely to be the ones that have probably the highest prices, and therefore the prices most likely to really pay for what it costs to produce biodiversity gains, and that are the most immediate. The voluntary markets, especially driven by global financial disclosure policies, are growing rapidly too. But I just think these kinds of regulatory systems are going to be the real driver for demand in biodiversity credits. We think of those two policy spaces as versions of offsetting, of essentially footprint offsetting. So either for existing operational impacts on nature or climate or water quality or anything, you're looking at your corporate or your community footprint on natural resources. Policies that I think we're used to that to me have been part of the way I grew up understanding environmental policy are regulatory offsetting policies. So in the United States, Clean Water Act, or in the UK, the Environment Act, Endangered Species Act here, or the new EU Nature Restoration Law. Those are laws, written by lawyers and scientists and environment agencies. The really new and interesting evolving space in offsetting policy and in environmental policy writ large are disclosure policies written by bankers and finance people working at a different ministries and agencies like the SEC, who bring a really different skill set and kind of mindset to what's involved, but are effectively leading to some of the same kinds of outcomes or same kind of structures for nature. In the US, this is roughly what the market for nature credits looks like today, driven by mostly the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. So, somewhere around 2 billion, estimates up to 4 billion of wetlands credits and stream credits happening under the Clean Water Act. And then you have sort of a smaller market for water quality credits from a different component of Clean Water Act, but also state laws. And then endangered species habitat banking or habitat restoration, driven by the Endangered Species Act. And those endangered species projects are primarily in states like Texas, Florida, California, places with really rapid, especially residential, but also highway and other infrastructure development. And these are examples of some of the types of biodiversity banks that exist in the United States, or the species that are the focus of those banks. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but this is information you can find on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's website and in other places. In most cases, although there's a target species that the biodiversity credit is focused on, the projects are really are basically ecosystem banks. They're looking at the condition of the overall habitat. And then the last piece I wanted to share, and this is by way of really trying to set up the connection between America and then what David's going to talk about in the United Kingdom and England specifically. These are some of the principles that at least we think are important, that many of which have arisen through a few decades of work under those laws that I just described for biodiversity offsets, biodiversity credits, and ecosystem credits. So things like guarantees, right, that ecological performance is going to occur on properties. One of the most obvious of those is in the case of wetland banks in the United States, where you can't sell a credit until the government confirms that a restoration has happened. Usually also almost always land protection has happened. There's a permanent easement on the site, and that the habitat or ecosystem management activities have also taken place, and there's some indication of biological response to that management. So there's principles like that, requirements like that have evolved in under U.S. policy and in other places as well around the world. And then a set of other policies around disclosure and transparency, around monitoring, around financing, long-term financing for projects that are really important and in building a consistently high quality from a nature perspective and from a public perspective supply of biodiversity credits that can be used in our offset programs. These kinds of principles evolved in one space. There are carbon credit policies and principles that we can talk about as well during the Q&A. And together, these sets of policies and principles are then have a chance to influence global evolution of both regulatory systems that need biodiversity credits and voluntary systems. A quick view of what endangered species habitat bank looks like in the United States. This is a California bank of about 300 acres that creates endangered garter snake habitat, and it's backed by a company called Westervelt Ecological Services, which has recently attracted $400 million of investment from a Canadian pension fund called CDPQ. The last thing I want to share is just this slide, and it's kind of, I hope, setting things up for David's remarks next, which is that in the United States, as I mentioned, we have endangered species banks for the ecosystems that endangered species are present in. But there's a lot of biodiversity in the United States. By some accounts, we're a top 20, top 30 country for biodiversity. Our endangered species law covers a tiny fraction of the plant and animal diversity in the United States. Even just a tiny fraction of the species that have been identified as at risk, for example, by NatureServe. There's far more biodiversity in the country that is either its status is unknown or that may be secure or at least somewhat secure. Our law, and many of you know about some of the trials and tribulations of the Endangered Species Act, covers that little tiny wedge for endangered species. The boldness of England's law is that it covers the entire pie. It covers all biodiversity, all ecosystems. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's so special and so interesting and so important. And just really looking forward to David's remarks next. And I will stop sharing. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Tim. I think that was a great way to set the stage. And now we can dive into today's presentation on unpacking England's biodiversity net gain law. We'll be hearing from Professor David Hill, the founder and chairman of Environment Bank. Please go ahead, David, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Tim. Thanks for both for the invite. It's very kind. I'm going to try and share my screen and hope that it does work okay. Okay, so can we see that? Right, let me go back. Okay, so can we see that? Are you both? Can you see that, Tim?
Yes.
That's okay. You can see that. So yeah, many thanks for the invite to talk about this subject, which has been close to my heart for the last 20 years. And I'm going to talk about BNG, how it emerged, why I felt that we needed something back in the day to compensate for the development impacts that certainly weren't being addressed in the UK. And then I'm going to sort of expand it out a little bit at the end around how BNG can set the conceptual framework really for the excuse me, for the environmental markets for nature restoration, which we've actually really got to see very, very quickly given the finance gap for funding nature. I thought I'd just start though by giving you a bit of a picture of the landscape around biodiversity conservation in the UK. That this isn't the full suite of organisations that work on biodiversity in the NGO sector, but it gives you a flavour of the complexity of the landscape really, and the competitive nature of that landscape. I mean, it is quite extraordinary, and we put something like £750 million into biodiversity conservation, either through the NGOs or through government agri-environment funding. And that's a pretty small amount, and it pales into insignificance when we look at the finance gap for that nature, which is by recent estimates running at around 4.5 to 9.7 billion pounds sterling a year that we need. So effectively, we've got to really do something significant in the future. But this is really an interesting slide, I think, because despite all of this amazing activity and great work that generally these organisations do, this is the biodiversity indicator for the UK for the 228, what we call priority species. These are the species which we regard as the most important for protection. And you can see that actually we're not doing very well. And the business model is pretty much bust. The levelling off, tiny bit of levelling off from 2000 onwards isn't that material. It's just that things are so bad that they, you know, how much worse can they get? So we've got a background of huge lack of funding, lots and lots of organisations trying to do things, and a 60% decline in the very biodiversity that we regard as a priority. And of course, you know, we know that the whole landscape for financing natural capital has changed in the last 5 years. We talk a lot about ecosystem service, biodiversity services, so freshwater, pollination, soil structure, climate regulation, food, medicines, etc., air quality regulation. And, you know, 55% of global GDP relies on what nature provides. And yet we've seen just an example in the UK, and there are other countries far worse, of a 60% decline. And we also know what the main loss drivers are. So poor land usage. Most of the damage has been done by intensive agriculture, and that's being addressed in the UK by a variety of policies and pressure to being brought to bear on politicians to change the agricultural system for the better. And it's a slow process. But also development has taken its toll. There's around 10,000 or more hectares of land in the UK gets developed. That doesn't sound a great deal, but it is year on year. It has an attritional impact on biodiversity. Climate change, obviously, invasive species, pollution, and the most perverse, which relate to all of those, human population growth. So it's against that background of around 20 odd years ago, I was doing a lot of environmental impact assessments, and I just realized that the mitigation schemes I was designing for developments to get them a planning permission were never taken up. I mean, it never happened. It was incredibly poor a model where development would come along for a particular site, design in mitigation schemes, get a planning permission, and then they'd go back to the planning authority to say, hey, you know what, our scheme isn't viable at the moment. We're going to have to sacrifice this biodiversity stuff. And so in 2006, I thought about why development shouldn't be required to provide a gain for nature. And that's when it all sort of started. In fact, that was in 2004. And I asked a conference of 400 ecologists to put their hands up to tell me if they could take me to a site that had really worked well for biodiversity mitigation that they'd designed, and not one person put their hand up. So it was pretty obvious to me that we had to change and disrupt the system. So I then started in 2006 setting up the Environment Bank as a lobbying exercise. 5 years later, the idea became a policy in what was called the 2011 Natural Environment White Paper, and some offsetting pilots were established in 2012. The government set up something called the Ecosystem Markets Task Force that I sat on, and that task force recommended that biodiversity offsetting be made mandatory. It was the first recommendation for how to generate private sector finance for nature. Going forwards, a whole range of things. I sat on the government's Natural England board and lobbied internally as well as externally for a change in the policy in law. All along this time, biodiversity net gain was available as a voluntary scheme, but it was gaining no traction whatsoever. There was not enough enforcement opportunity for the planning authorities. There was not enough pressure on developers to do it. Their planning permissions didn't rely on it, etc. Then by 2018, there was the 25-year environment plan where government put a priority in that development had to deliver net gain for biodiversity. And they also wanted to see 500,000 hectares of nature recovery network across the UK. But the big point came when the Chancellor of the Exchequer announced in the Queen's speech that the biodiversity net gain idea was going to be made mandatory through the enactment of what was then the Environment Bill. And so the Environment Act, when it came out in 2021, made biodiversity net gain mandatory under planning law, so that all development of a certain size had to deliver at least 10% increase in that biodiversity as a consequence of the development. And so by 2023, it was finally implemented in February, actually, not January 2024. There was some delay in implementation, but finally we did manage to get that. And after whatever it was, 18 years, we now are seeing that those that development has to deliver mandatory BNG. And it works something like this. The developer would apply something called the DEFRA metric. That's for the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And there's a metric that measures the biodiversity in quantitative and qualitative terms, applies the mitigation hierarchy to the development site, and then provides for biodiversity net gain either off-site or on-site. And I'm going to just differentiate between these two, because where I started the Environment Bank, it was purely because the on-site provision was a complete waste of time. It was not worth, it was just not worth investigating. Really good if developers do great landscaping and planting to sell houses or to sell commercial logistic warehousing or whatever they're doing. but it was not going to change the dial on biodiversity. Only off-site provision will do that. And so there's a whole range of risks around on-site provision. I'll look at those in a little bit more detail now. So the developer applies the deframetric, works out what the biodiversity impacts are of the development, applies a 10% uplift, and then is left with a residual once they've done some things on site, a residual that they have to compensate by buying into off-site schemes or projects. So just running through the issues. So on-site delivery, basically too small for biodiversity, very fragmented. You need something called a Section 106 agreement restrictive on the land, and developers are very wary and unlikely to do that. They just do not want that long-term obligation. There's no actual uplift in biodiversity from those on-site areas, unless you've got a very, very large residential scheme and you can sacrifice a large area of it. But that leads to a reduction in net developable area. If you're a logistics plant or a commercial warehousing scheme like a distribution sheds or factory, you cannot achieve it on site. And anyway, what is the point? Who's going to benefit from that, really? Even within housing residential schemes, who really is going to benefit from lots of what is often pretty untidy, scrubby grassland, woodland habitat? It usually gets removed by a management company that comes in once the developer has left. And the developer is liable for all the on-site for the 30 years that is locked in for biodiversity net gain in the UK. And then impacts from disturbance, of course, on those developed sites once they're under occupation means that biodiversity is pretty poor. Whereas off-site delivery gives bigger, better and joined biodiversity value. It removes the developer's liability. It's regulated through a government registry. So all off-site, what we call habitat banks that I'll mention in a minute, have to be registered by government. It increases ecosystem function and resilience, for example, to climate change at scale, if we can do large sites for multiple development purchases. Next to regenerative agriculture gives big wins, which is really good. And then we get income diversification into the rural economy. And we can create large number of new nature reserves through this mechanism. And finally, it drives private finance into nature restoration. All of these are the benefits of off-site delivery. So if we look at the fundamentals really of the regime, there are 5 bits to it. Regulation, there's the Environment Act 2021, a mandatory more than a 10% biodiversity net gain increase. And some of the planning authorities are actually imposing 30% gain. So it's within their jurisdiction to be able to go beyond 10%. It's not, that 10% isn't set nationally. And it's part of the planning process. So if the developer can't achieve it or won't achieve it, they can't get planning permission. We get validated biodiversity uplifts by the deframetric. So there's the standard which underpins the market really. And an uplift is quantified as BNG units, biodiversity net gain units. The assets that we're creating with Environment Bank and others doing similar things are the habitat banks. These are at the moment up to 100 plus hectares of land maintained for 30 years, where we finance the creation and the long-term management of that biodiversity uplift. In terms of the purchaser, they are the developers who need to deliver BNG as part of their planning, and they fulfill what's called a biodiversity gain document that has to go with that planning permission, so with that planning application. That in doing so, they actually outsource the risk and the management, and we sell the BNG to them as BNG credits. So we don't mention offsets, but that's essentially what they are when they've gone through the mitigation hierarchy. And then that's managed through Section 106s or conservation covenants maintained by the landowner to, in our case, Environment Bank's specification, and the costs are all fixed. So, oops, sorry, I've lost my place. Hang on a minute, lost my place here. So, we think that the habitat banks that we are proposing provide the best outcomes for nature, society, and the rural economy. And I've mentioned the key factors there. You get large landscape scale restoration projects sited in the best place for nature, not necessarily adjacent to a development site, which can get disturbed heavily, as we know. The forward funding is really important. So many sort of folk out there trying to raise BNG on sites that they can sell credits from don't have a 30-year funding mechanism. And that's really important, that there is guaranteed funding. As Tim said, that, you know, we're looking at working on a whole set of criteria that will lock down the best model that one would expect to see, which gives the legitimacy for selling BNG units in the future, or credits in the future. Annual reporting and monitoring is really important, and we want to see auditable and legally compliant projects, so that auditing of those projects is by third parties is something that is being looked at now. So what is a habitat bank? Well, it's a landscape scale habitat creation project of sufficient size to deliver the best outcomes for nature. As I mentioned, all the establishment costs are forward funded, and it's not reliant on developer or corporate payments to be established. We as Environment Bank provide that finance, and then we generate revenue from the sale of those units. That generates the uplift in biodiversity value measured by the standard, by that metric. And as I say, they're sold to developers for them to meet their requirements. I've put in here the corporate sector because we're going to be looking, and I'll mention at the end, the idea of nature credits or biodiversity credits that Tim gave a really good overview on before I spoke. And the sorts of places that we are, or habitats that we're creating, are woodlands, wood meadows, wetland complexes, species-rich grassland, and then woodland scrub grassland mosaics. The latter of those actually provides the biggest uplift in biodiversity because of the ecotones that are created, the edge habitats that's created. And then generally our sites are between 20 hectares, and we've got one in the pipeline of around 500 hectares. So for the scale of the UK, that latter one is incredibly significant. And they look something like this. So this is a bit of a sort of here's one that we produced earlier. It's a mock-up of what it will look like. It looks nothing like that at the moment. It's pretty degraded land, but this is a 49-hectare site connected to what's called the West Pennine Moors Site of Special Scientific Interest in the uplands of England near Manchester. And the habitat we'll create here is going to be lowland meadow, natural grassland, mixed scrub, broadleaf woodland with ponds and lowland fen. So a real complex of habitat that we can actually design in from the very beginning, because we've effectively got a clean slate. This is currently very poor, intensively grazed neutral grassland, and that will be transformed over time. And a similar site, this one, 38 hectares in the middle of England, near a place called Milton Keynes, is connected nicely to ancient and newly planted woodland, so a combination of the two. And here we're going to be creating species-rich grassland, native mixed scrub and hedgerows. And you can see on the right there what it looked like before we are intervening. So in this case, it was a large parcel of arable farmland adjacent to that woodland. And we're going to really start to stitch back the fabric of the countryside by bringing these habitats in. They do stay within the farming sector if they are grazed. One of the issues that we found was that farmers were wary of changing the land use such that something called agricultural property relief, which is a tax incentive, isn't removed. And we've managed to achieve that. So that's a really important milestone, really. So in terms of the landowner, they, with Environment Bank, create the biodiversity. We take out a lease on the land for a 30 to 32 years or so period. The landowner benefits from a tax-efficient farm business tenancy structure from us. And then we have these long-term fixed payments which offer this income diversification. And the landowner has to maintain that habitat bank for 30 years. The planning authority are the next key player, because they endorse the BNG credits that are claimed as part of that habitat bank. And they will enter into a Section 106 with ourselves and the landowner, which is an agreement to monitor and regulate that habitat bank. The amount of BNG credits assigned is based on the deframetric. So that's a standardization. And there are checks to ensure that the biodiversity is maintained over a 30-year period. And so we've got a fairly sophisticated monitoring and annual reporting program that feeds information back to the planning authority when they require it. And then the developer are the buyers. They get on with their development. They need to create this minimum 10% BNG. They buy the credits from us or others, paying in advance. So we don't really allow a developer to buy them in a phased way. They need to secure all of the BNG up front, because as often happens, as time goes by, the developers might try and get out of that system. You know, we need to get the finance in place right on day one so that we can actually secure that biodiversity for the long term. And then in terms of when government was setting this up, there was a potential for a real barrier here. The barrier was around pricing of what the government called statutory backstop units or statutory biodiversity credits. They were worried that there was never going to be a market generated where people would invest in land to bring forward the credits that they could sell to the developer. And so there was a worry that the developer would have nothing to buy. So the government came with the idea of setting up these statutory units so that if there was not a local supplier, the developer could buy directly from government. And when they set this out, it was fairly clear that they hadn't been able to think in enough detail of what the pricing should be. And so we worked with them to say, what you must do is to make sure that the pricing is effectively almost a disincentive to buy just directly from government, which might be an easier thing to do, but will not generate finance into the natural environment in the local area where that development is taking place. So here are the unit pricings for grassland, lowland meadow, and wetland pond habitat. Our prices are in the middle there, and the effective natural England price or DEFRA price there is 84,000, for example, for grassland, versus our own is 28. So they are substantially more expensive than ours or other providers. And that's really important, because we didn't really want to see a situation where the developer could just simply go and buy them off the shelf from government, because it would almost like a get out of jail free card. And we wanted much better at local engagement with them. So that is starting to work quite well, I think. In terms of scale, over the next 5 years, this is based on May 2023, so this is a year out of date, but we've currently about 23 habitat banks being created out there, so still a small number. But you can see there's around 15,000 hectares of land changes from non-developed to developed use in England every year. And that generates a requirement of around 15,000 to 24,000 offsite BNG units as measured by the deframetric. That then converts to around 2,500–3,000 or so hectares needed every year for BNG. So in the scheme of things, that 3,000 hectares or 4,000 hectares maximum is not that much. When you multiply that with the prices per unit, so you get between 5 and 7 units per hectare, that generates a potential market of BNG of between £420 million to £670 million per year. But having said that, it's still quite a way short of actually that nature finance gap that I mentioned earlier. So I'll come on shortly to see where we might actually use the BNG model to scale this whole idea. And this is it. So in my view, one of the biggest values of BNG is not necessarily just around the development sector, but it provides the legacy for providing wider environmental market development. And there is the rest of the UK. So BNG is only relevant at the moment in England, but we know that Wales and Scotland and I think Northern Ireland are looking at something similar. They're bound to call it something different. They always do, because that's how we operate in the UK. You know, we don't, if England comes up with sort of biodiversity net gain, I think the Scots will probably call it net gain for biodiversity, but there we are. That's politics. but it's still the same principle, and I think probably still based on a similar or the same metric. But the big ones really for me are probably marine, natural asset stacking, and the corporate sector. So this is all around, as Tim mentioned, TNFD mandate, investor pressure, all of those things coming to bear to really see the corporate sector needing to do the disclosure, which will drive them, we hope, down the route of nature positivity. And they can then invest in habitat bank type models to do ecosystem function rebuilding over time. Nutrient neutrality was it's something that came along where if developers were creating a residential scheme and there were phosphates and nitrates likely to emanate from those developments, they needed to make sure that those nutrients were not adding to the nutrient burden in our already overburdened river systems, which we are trying to do something about, I hope. But it's very spatially constrained, and there are catchments specifically where nutrient neutrality is a key thing, and other areas where it's not. So that's it's not a countrywide issue, the nutrient neutrality piece, but nonetheless, it's another asset class for natural capital. And then finally, looking at why is the market looking for it? Well, identifying, measuring, disclosing, and reducing our impacts on biodiversity really isn't enough. There's regulatory pressure, investor pressure, etc. And I think this is the key. This is the thing that will really drive corporates to become nature positive. And there are policy drivers there underway. So the UK has a business and biodiversity forum. There's the TNFD, the Nature Positive Movement, Sustainable Finance Initiative, the Terra Carta that the King set up some time ago, Natural Capital Coalition, etc. So these are the standards that are, sorry, these are the policy drivers that are working towards building that requirement for disclosure by corporate entities. And just the penultimate slide, I think, is this. It's quite interesting to see BNG scaling. It's taking a long time, but the corporate scaling, this is just based on market intelligence from Environmental Finance Journal from January this year to April this year. And you see, if you look through those, the natural capital will become a fundamental component of investors' portfolios. Nature, the next frontier of sustainability, says the Royal Bank of Canada. Moreover, to question companies on biodiversity commitments ahead of their AGMs. There's a whole industry now around within the investment sector, pushing corporates to do what they've got to do to reduce their impacts on nature and natural capital and become nature positive. Sorry, this is the penultimate slide, I think. So if you wanted to try and get a very crude analysis of what the value of that corporate market might be, if we're saying that BNG might contribute, I don't know, 500 million, let's say, per year to nature recovery and biodiversity. I did some analysis of our inquiries to our Environment Bank between June 2020 and February 2023. We had 146 inquiries for purchasing BNG units. And if you map those onto area of the development versus the costs as a percentage of the gross development value, on average, well, you can see there, big developments, the cost is pretty minimal. Smaller developments, yes, the costs go up to sort of 2, 3, 4% of gross development value. On average, it's around 0.41 to 0.68%. So if you crudely applied a 0.6% cost position on the 2.6 trillion GDP, which generates a potential of around 15.6 billion that could annually be invested into the natural environment, if these corporates were to take the same sorts of route to nature positive as the developers are required to do, then we can then easily bridge that nature finance gap and really start to see some big impacts on nature recovery in the UK. And this is just finally a site that shows what one might be able to achieve at big scale. This is a 500-hectare site. Really interesting, stitching back whole catchments and transforming marginal land into an ecosystem mosaic of biodiversity-rich habitats, fully funded for its lifetime. So BNG really working well on the development side, but I think is setting the legacy for the biodiversity credit market potential in the UK. And I'm going to end it there. And there's just you can find out more on our website, and there's a podcast if you want to listen to me talking to interesting people, including Tim, I have to say, on looking at how environmental markets will probably scale in the future. I'm just going to stop sharing. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, David. So we have about 20 minutes for questions. So if anyone does have a question, please type it into the Q&A, but we already have some good fodder to get started. I've been looking through, I feel like there are kind of two categories of questions, some about scaling this law and perhaps replicating it elsewhere, and then some about kind of nitty-gritty details of how this law actually works. So I'm going to start big and then hone into the details. But there's a question that was actually submitted at the time of registration that asks about what are challenges to implementing a similar law in the United States. And maybe, Tim, you could talk about if you've thought about that at all. And then, David, a related question is, do you know if the UK is in discussion with any other governments to replicate this law elsewhere? So, Tim, maybe we could start with you.
Brad, I thought you were going to start with David. There's lots of challenges, right? And the pie chart I showed at the end is kind of captures them most succinctly, which is that at this, I mean, I know that the Endangered Species Act kind of was a noble and super ambitious thing when it was passed in the 70s, but in hindsight, it almost looks like a pilot project, like a pilot effort, because it covers so few species. And even even if you just look at the kind of nature serve imperiled species, there's 15,000 species that really deserve some higher level of attention. We've created a system that has so much political friction to it. In other words, it's so hard to avoid, it's so hard to minimize, and then it's so hard to offset impacts on species or to plan recovery investments, that it becomes very difficult to envision a structure as comprehensive as what England has done. Nonetheless, I think the key part of it, and I see some of the potential for a law like this in the United States mirrored in the Clean Water Act and its implementation at the local level, is that if you can create a really efficient system around the kind of offsetting that David just described in England, so that transactions don't take very long and that the cost of the transaction might be high, but it's not so high that no one builds anything ever, right? There's some mysterious point in the middle, that then we could actually, see something like this happen in the United States. The two other things I've identified as quickly are, one, David emphasized the role of local planning authorities. In America, that would be county governments, city governments, state government to some extent, or regional bodies. And a lot of it is deferred down to that level. And we know there's lots of trade-offs involved with local government involvement, and certainly England has challenges in implementing it because of just training and capacity issues. But at scale, like that's local government would have to play a role in something like that in the United States. The last thing I'll emphasize is something that's kind of buried in the UK Environment Act, which is it makes 2020 a bit of a baseline year, so that if you have a property and you want to go out and start stewarding it today, even if it's not recognized as a habitat bank, that in theory, all that stewardship from 2020 onward could at some point in the future be recognized. And Sarah, I know on these webinars in the past, spent a lot of time talking about farmers and ranchers and the ones that do amazing stewardship on their properties. And one of the key aspects of the Environment Act in England is 10 and 20 years from now, when they're talking about kind of new waves of implementation and new needs or demand for more credits and supply, is that anyone who's been doing good stewardship from kind of day one still has a chance to contribute, that they're not essentially penalized for early stewardship. And if we had a policy like that in the United States that existed a decade or 2 decades before any effort like this to create a national program existed, it would make implementation so much easier. David, over to you.
Oh, sorry, you're still on mute.
Yeah, can I pick up on some of the questions in the chat? Because these are some really interesting ones from, I think, Lydia here. one was, are you setting up a data system to collect, organize, and share the monitoring and auditing data for future evaluation of the program? Yes, and that's a standard, fairly detailed CRM that we are collecting information on, and we will make that physically available so that there is transparency around how these schemes are operating. Who is responsible if restoration fails? Well, we found that the landowners actually don't really like the idea of having that full responsibility, and they're cautious about signing up with us if they suddenly think in year 15 we could say to them, hang on a minute, this isn't working, we want all the money back that we've given you. So we have an insurance policy mechanism, and I know that Tim and I and others have been talking about insurance policies for these sorts of failures in the future. But we have that system in place so that we have a sort of restorative fund that can kick in and get that site back on track, and that gives the landowner a lot of comfort, I think. And then, is there a plan for renewal for these sites after 30 years? There isn't, but what we expect will happen is that those sites could go again, because they could, although they wouldn't need the creation finance, they could go for future habitat creation, habitat management annually. And I think similarly, there was a question about, is there enough land available? There is absolutely, with the 3,000 hectare a year is a very small amount. And we always get the issue about, but what about food security? And I try and always rebut that by saying, the way we grow food now is pretty crazy, and there will be a much better way of growing food as we transition to agroecological approaches to farming and new methodologies, et cetera, dietary changes will lead to there being more land available for nature recovery, I think, rather than less. So I don't think the two operate in competition. Sorry, any others you think I should? I'm just trying to think other ones I should pick up on.
Yeah. Well, I
changing
think
governments. Yeah.
there was one question that kind of returned to the mitigation hierarchy and
Yeah.
how the policy, or whether the policy, encourages avoidance or reduction of impacts first, before the kind of crediting piece.
It absolutely does. The mitigation hierarchy is key to the whole of it. And what was happening previously was that there was no following of the mitigation hierarchy. There was sort of tokenism for biodiversity, but development went ahead. Now it's much more, because of the regulation, the mandate, it's much more transparent, and the developer really has to sign up to a commitment to that biodiversity net gain. And to do that, they go through the mitigation hierarchy, and there will be instances where the development in that particular location is totally unacceptable. If it is acceptable and they then have to look at mitigating the risks, then they can do that by design. And then ultimately, this gives them a quantification for what the residual impacts are. And I endlessly, used to see years ago where it said a development, they did all the ecological surveys, they did the EIA, and the conclusion was no likely significant effect or impact. Absolute rubbish, because there always is. And so now we've got that quantified, they can then say what they're going to do about that residual, and preferably they can then modify what they do around the on-site because of its lack of value to biodiversity, and put more into it in off-site. But the net effect is that there would be more biodiversity through this methodology than we've ever seen before in the history of planning in the UK, I think.
Yeah. And then could we return to that question of, is the UK talking to any other countries about potentially replicating this elsewhere?
I'm not as fully aware as to where DEFRA is on that at the moment. I think we do know certain countries have been in touch with the UK to say, how have you implemented this? What does it look like? And they will certainly make available all the information that they can to that. But I don't know, does Tim, do you know if they if whether our government is actually in discussions with others to replicate it?
Yeah, I don't know of a formal consultation,
formal.
like an in-depth consultation, but I would mention that we're working with an organization based in the UK actually created by the UK government called the Green Finance Institute
Yeah.
to do in-depth, basically policy analysis of 4 countries, including England's policy. And then the Green Finance Institute is going to support 4 other countries that are interested in developing, biodiversity structures like this to figure out how to adopt portions of the US, UK, and other countries' markets, including, or not markets, policies, including Colombia.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There's an interesting point here about how will the approach work in countries that are more centrally controlled. I think that's reference to the fact that there is, with our planning system, each jurisdiction or not necessarily county, but the counties are split into planning authority areas, and there are 360 to 380 planning authorities in England alone. And there is a great differentiation as to how they are implementing this. Some have bitten the bullet and getting on with it and staffed up with lots of people to help. And others are still thinking, what is this all about? Even though it's in law and they've got a legal duty to do it. So there is a great deal of differentiation. And one tends to think that it may have been easier had there just been one planning system, in England, but it was never going to happen. Every little authority is different in some shape or form. And that is good in some ways, but bad in others. It makes it quite difficult to implement.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key issues, if it's a more centrally controlled country, the key question is whether there's actually like local zoning, development planning, et cetera, that's controlled at the central level. Because what may frequently exist is you've got a more centrally controlled country where there's still no actual development, restrictions. Like, what can you build a factory next to a house, right? Like that. So if that doesn't exist at all, then it's obviously going to be very difficult to put biodiversity in policy in place because there's nothing to attach it to. And that kind of analogy in the United States, the kind of weird thing that compared to the England's policy is we have local, almost exclusively local control over land use decisions, but then the Endangered Species Act is kind of a national strap-on top of it. And maybe California, some other areas, but certainly California's work on habitat conservation plans and similar ecosystem plans is an interesting version of taking the national policy and then bringing it down to effectively the local level. There are examples in other parts of the country too, Texas and Florida as well, but that's like it's gotten this most similar to a delegated control around biodiversity management.
Yeah, I think the local authorities, they're all supposed to have what's called a local plan, which shows the development allocation. But you do get development outside of those areas as well, and they have to be evaluated on their merits. But that's the starting point. So that's how we worked out what the demand will be in each local authority area, is to look at the local plans. There's a really interesting point here about will the amount of land be exceeded. I think the point here being, will we be able to identify whether the 6% decline noted at the beginning will be reversed under this scheme? The simple answer to that is absolutely not. There's no chance at all that we will reverse that 60% decline with BNG alone on 3,000 hectares. It's not possible. We need to be getting into the hundreds of thousands of hectares nature recovery, and that's why the corporate sector is going to be crucial to make this work. So the pressure now, I mean, having sort of feel as though I've done BNG, all of my work and theory and thinking now is going to be around working with the likes of Tim on how we do this biodiversity credits for the corporate sector, because that's a much bigger market, probably 12 times the market, and we can then really start to see how things can move forward. But at the moment, BNG won't make much of an impact on that 60% decline. But what would make a big impact will be changes in agricultural policy, and there's very quickly, there's something called Basic Payment Scheme, which is a subsidy to farmers. We've removed that, and that transitions away to zero by 2027. So there'll be a lot of farms very stretched financially. So they are going to need to look for new models of finance and revenue streams. And nature finance is I think, the one that can do really good things, where we just basically make land cover more complex and sophisticated and more interesting, and biodiversity will follow. That's in my head anyway. I think that's where we want to be with it.
I see a couple questions here related to kind of equity and equivalence. So could you maybe talk a little bit about the development of the DEFRA metric that sort of defines the quantity of biodiversity, and then also how there's, or whether there's kind of insurance that the biodiversity from the credit is equivalent to the biodiversity impacted by development?
Yeah, so the excuse me, the metric is based on three components really. One is the area of the particular habitat that's being impacted. One is the the distinctiveness of that habitat. And the other is, the third is the condition of that habitat. So for example, if you'd got a large area of intensively farmed arable land, yes, it's a large area, but it's, well, let's go a small area of intensively farmed arable land, which is therefore low distinctiveness habitat and of poor condition for biodiversity. That has got minimal biodiversity units associated with it. It's still got some, but it might be 0.5 or 1 unit per hectare. If, on the other hand, you have an area that is relatively moderately species-rich, neutral grassland, and there's a big area of it that's going to have a housing scheme on it, and it's in pretty good condition, the value of units that will generate that need to be mitigated and hence compensated for will be much, much bigger. So it's based on those three things, and then and you apply that to the development, and then you look at things like spatial multiplier risk. What are the risks there? So if a developer has got the opportunity to buy units from a habitat bank that's 20 kilometers away, there's some spatial risk, which means they have to buy more credits than they would if it was 5 kilometers away. So there are sort of qualitative variables within that metric that enable you to do that, and also to trade up. So if you wanted, I don't know, 56 species-rich grassland units, you could trade up to something of even a higher order, and you wouldn't necessarily need as many units, but the costs might be disproportionately higher. So it works there's a lot of information on the DEFRA website about how the metric works. And we have a team of people now that spend most of their time just doing metric calculations on that basis.
So I think we have time for one last question. There's a question that just came in about the U.S. Endangered Species Act and pushback from wind energy development related to the magnitude of mitigation, suggesting that we need to seek more offset mitigation than the harm. And so, Tim, I think, could you respond to that?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to address that one, Sarah. And I support the wind industry on this, because it's just a mistake to take a single sector of the economy that happens to be the one with a lot of momentum right now, and then try to up the standard just on that one. And in particular, this one is tricky, right? Because the cumulative effect of wind, let's just pick on wind deployment in the United States is actually reducing global extinctions. We can't identify the species in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or anywhere else that are saved if the world transitions to wind, but there's lots of biodiversity benefit, a cumulative effect, a positive effect that's completely outside our system to measure it. In contrast to, let's say, coal mining, which has the opposite effect, right? It's not just causing the local effect, it's also causing a cumulative global effect on lots of biodiversity that we can't identify. So I think the problem is that frame, and instead to say, we're going to try to create a structure that asks for net loss or net gain, and focus on types of activities that really clearly have the biggest effect on biodiversity that's kind of outside our system to process, right? The things we kind of can't quantify, to focus it there first, and then say, okay, right, now let's go back to whether we make a system like this more comprehensive, right? So just to use an example, in England's policy started initially, there's basically a de minimis effect. There's small scale projects that aren't covered by the policy. Even national infrastructure projects like wind farms wouldn't be covered by the policy initially, and then it phases in over time. So you focus on the kind of the things that are causing the biggest harm. And to me, the mistake of focusing on wind is it's not the sector that's causing the biggest, deepest cumulative harm around the planet.
Can I just add a couple of points on the couple of questions that came in? We didn't get much pushback really from the development community, not as much as we probably thought we might. We did in the early days, but everyone got on board with it, and so the developer community don't oppose BNG. I mean, they do. They're not necessarily desperately running ahead saying, "Hey, fantastic," but they are getting on with it because they know that they can't get a planning permission without it. And then equity, yeah, really is important. So it's really important that the investments make sure that the landowning sector do significantly well out of the scheme, because otherwise you've got to be really careful they don't feel as though they're being ripped off. That's what I would say. And I think there was a final point about my email is just dhill@environmentbank.com. And if anybody did want to follow up with any of these questions out with the webinar, then I'm really happy to try and answer them whenever I can. So just drop me an email.
Yeah, and well, so I will be emailing the recording link of this webinar to everyone who registered. And so if you didn't get that email, feel free to reach back out to me and I can connect you to David or Tim.
Fantastic.
But thank you so much, both of you, for being here today. I think this was a great conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone. Bye. Bye-bye.